Well, I was a student. I was nearly 16 years old, and I'd been at art school for about a week, and I'd met my friend Bobby Hunt, and we got on very well. We had mutual interests, and I think it was the first. It was the Thursday of the first week of term in autumn 1945, and Bobby introduced me to Johnnie because Bobby had been at the art school for some time, and immediately he sort of rushed us out to lunch, and from then on we were close friends.
I was 14. I won a scholarship in the previous May, and I'd gone to a very dreary art school in Doncaster, which had been full of old ladies painting flowers. And the last thing I wanted to do was to be an art student. I thought it was terrible. But going to Campbell changed my mind completely. And also, what was interesting was that Johnnie not only introduced us to painting and drawing, but also to film and to theatre and to reading. I mean, at that time, most I'd read would probably be sort of Sherlock Holmes or something. And Johnnie got me interested in literature and gave me books to read. And not just me, but all of us.
Yes, I'd lived in southeast London for most of my life, although I was evacuated on and off during the war. And I think that what we all found at the time, through being evacuated, our education had been disrupted very badly. We'd all been made very miserable, very upset by the war. I think we were all looking for a good time, really. But when the war ended, we thought it was going to be a moment of release. Of course, it didn't happen just like that. The period of austerity set in fact, but we were of an age where we were looking around. We were looking for girls. We were looking for cigarettes. We were looking for booze or anything that would constitute a good time. And Johnnie just happened to come along at the right time, and he was a sophisticated man who was 12 years older than we were, and he lived a good life. He had little money. He was extremely generous, and he introduced us to Soho and to all of his friends, and to a life of relative sophistication and eating out and drinking in pubs and meeting a lot of very, very exciting and different people. Campbell was the most totally chaotic school, which is the reason probably why it was so successful, because the administration broke down constantly. There was no record of people being there. I was able to formulate my own course entirely. Within a week of working in the commercial art department, I concluded that I didn't like that, but I did like John Minton. I did like the Euston Road painters, so really I used to go in and do a day in the life class, 2 days with Johnnie, and then Susan Einzig joined the staff, and I spent a day with her class and with Keith Vaughan, of course. And really, we did, it sounds appalling in a way, but it worked. We did pretty much what we wanted to do.
We did an illustration course because Minton encouraged us to do one, although Passmore and Coldstream and the painting school were very anti-illustration. It divided us between those. And we weren't thinking of commercial art in the sense of working for advertising. We were thinking of illustration in the sense of book illustration. And the thing was that Johnnie felt that we were going to be able to make a living, at least as illustrators like he did, and paint at the same time. Where the painting school were very against it, that you either got trained as a teacher and then painted on the side, or you had a private income. Right. Well, if you came from a sort of working class background, basically as we did, I mean, we're not going to have private incomes. So the thing is that the only way we could make a living would be by teaching or by doing illustration. Yeah. And Minton felt it was healthier to accept illustration than teach.
So we had no money at all. I mean, this was another allure of Johnnie's, that he was able to pay for us. I mean, we weren't exactly kept boys, but he just liked our company, and he wanted to take us around and show us the world. He introduced us to foreign food, to foreign films, to drink, and a good life. And it was most exciting, very, very stimulating. I mean, things which one now takes for granted were so exciting in those days. I mean, my first spaghetti bolognese, I remember, in Tony's in Charlotte Street. First clubs, the Mandrake Club and that sort of thing. It was absolutely incredible, because we were starved, really. We were starved of any kind of colour, any kind of adventure, any kind of taste. I'd never tasted garlic in my life, I mean, until I met Johnny Minton. This is something which is very difficult to convey nowadays, I think. A word that's used a lot by people in the connection with the 50s and the late 40s is innocence, and it's true. It was a very much more innocent place. I think that, as one might have been, given the kind of person that I was, I had a sort of a yearning for a kind of bohemia. which wasn't exactly fulfilled. Well, yes, it was fulfilled by Johnnie, what I was talking about. We went to visit his studio, which was a wonderful studio, which he shared with Robert Kahuna McBride in Notting Hill Gate. And it was the traditional studio with a tortoise stove, which was roaring away, big north light, and just a feeling of industry and stacks of paintings and smell of turpentine and oils, and I was overwhelmed. We both were. Until that moment, I don't think either of us knew exactly what we wanted to do, but we decided that night on our return home, rather naively, that we wanted to be painters.
Lucian Freud and John, and Francis Bacon, I met through Johnnie, through the connections there, and the writers as well, Stephen Spender and people like that, and poets, Dylan Thomas and W.S. Graham, Scott's poet. And so we were drawn in. And in those days, the Bohemian society was Soho, basically. And Sundays, Notting Hill Gate was the area. And Saturdays and Fridays, it was Soho. And everybody met there. And it was a small community because there was a sort of Hampstead set and a Chelsea set, but they all emerged in Soho. And it was very stimulating if you were a young man, because one met sort of already established artists, and they took one seriously, and we didn't all talk about art all the time, but at least one got involved in the sort of mainstream of what was happening in this country.
It was a bit of a pattern. We would start at the Wheat Sheaf in Rathbone Place, go to the Black Horse, and then there used to be a pub on the corner of Soho Street, which was called the Queen's Arms, I think, and it just went on. There was the Highlander, the Dog and Duck, and then down into Soho. We didn't use the French pub much in those days, but we did go to the Helvetia, a Swiss pub, and it was a pattern that was laid down. And if we stayed on later, then we'd go to the Mandrake for a plate of spaghetti or something like that. But everybody sort of moved together. There'd be Johnnie and his entourage, and there'd be Kahuna McBride and various other people, perhaps Lucian Freud, Clement Freud, I remember being around for a while, and all moving together, John Heath Stubbs and so on. He was very successful because he'd just had two very important and successful shows, and he was being used as an illustrator everywhere. I mean, he illustrated regularly for Lilliput and all kinds of magazines and books, of course, no end of book covers, the John Lehman books, new writings, that sort of thing. His work was everywhere. I mean, he was tremendously prolific. He worked at such a speed, it was absolutely amazing. And he was a wonderful illustrator. It was because of that, in a way, that I suppose I became an illustrator myself. I don't know. I'm wary about saying things like that because I think that there's a certain amount of inevitability about it. If you work in a certain kind of way, that's the way it will lead. But because Johnnie and many other painters at the time didn't seem to turn a hair about being both painters and illustrators, one assumed as a young student that this was absolutely fine, as indeed it is. I mean, I see nothing wrong with it.
What did Johnnie used to call me? This is my ghost, and this is my ghost, because a lot of his drawings I did the underdrawing for. I mean, not the finished work, but for instance, if he got a book to illustrate, he would give me lots of references of this. We do a very rough composition thing, and I'd do all the pencil drawing into the detail of the architecture, all the things, and then he would come along and say, that's a little rubbish, or somebody say it's very good, according to the bits he liked. He would then work over the top of it. But he was doing so much work, and he worked so fast. I mean, it was the same when we did murals, because I did 2 or 3 large murals with Johnnie on Festival of Britain and stuff. He did the original sketches, and I used to square them up and do the underdrawing. And of course, for me, it was very good, because apart from the training, it was also financially rewarding,
Saturdays was sort of fun days where I went to the cinema. We went to the cinema a lot, incidentally. It was a big influence on all our lives, particularly on Johnnie's, I might say. And he had a sort of love affair with tea houses. I think he liked Lyons very much. So we'd often go to Lyons Corner House for tea or something like that. And similarly, when we stayed overnight, we'd have breakfast in Lyons Corner House at Marble Arch. And we would go usually to a foreign film, but not always. He loved John Ford films and the new, the sort of cinema verite of the time, films like Gentleman's Agreement and that sort of thing. And then we would go on the circuit, drinking and probably eat late and go back to Hamilton Terrace, which is where he lived then, and go to bed. And the next day we'd get up and go for a walk, have a couple of drinks at lunchtime. But every Sunday afternoon we drew. And we drew, and we drew, and we drew, and we drew each other. It was usually Bobby Hunt, Eric Verico, myself, and Johnnie. And we turned out a prodigious amount of work. So it was highly beneficial. I remember an evening at Hamilton Terrace talking to Johnnie and Keith Vaughan, which was so nice because they didn't always get on. There was a certain tension there. And it was a very, very pleasant summer evening. We just sat and drank wine, and I felt so pleased to be with these two men who I admired so much. And it was, he didn't. He always treated one exactly as an equal. I mean, you know, he would treat one as a fellow artist, as it were. He wouldn't talk down to you in any kind of way, ever. It was a great mistake for them to share a house. There's no doubt about that. I like Keith very, very much, but he was a quiet, almost introverted man who occasionally went on a binge. But if he did so, it was a solitary binge, I think, more often than not, except for the boys that he'd pick up. But Johnnie was gregarious and he was highly sociable. And this led to a certain amount of strain because at the weekends, no doubt, Keith found us all a bit boisterous and a bit much. And it got really rather silly because they shared a kitchen and Keith would label his food and silly things like that, which Johnnie had absolutely no time for at all. It outraged him.
The thing was that none of us ever understood where Minton's money came from. And I didn't, even to this dying day, I don't really know, because he would never talk about it. I knew he had a private income, but I didn't know quite what it was. But evidently he owned D.H. Evans, which I never knew. Or he had major shares in D.H. Evans. I don't know whether he owned it or not. But there was all sorts of money in the background. I mean, I met his mother several times before she died, and she was a sweet old girl. And she had left her husband and was living with a taxi driver, which Johnnie found very amusing. And her husband had been a solicitor, but he died some years beforehand. And Johnnie had a brother who died in Normandy in 1944, and he was an officer in the army. But he also had another brother, which had been born mentally, defective, and was in a home. And I didn't realise Johnnie kept visiting this chap all the time. Nobody knew about it.
I was working for the British Road Services, and a dreadful job. I'd fallen in love with France, as I suppose most of us did in those days on our first visit abroad. And I used to go whenever I could. And there was one occasion when I couldn't get a seat on the train. Everything was booked. And I had to fly. It was the only way I could go. But I had no money. I mean, we were talking about £7.12 and sixpence to go Newhaven Dieppe, and £10 to fly. I couldn't afford it. And then an amazing thing happened. It's the only piece of luck I've ever had in my life, financially. I won an office sweepstake for £10. But it wasn't due to be paid until after I'd had my holiday in France. I telephoned Johnnie and asked him if he would lend me some money. I mean, he lent me money often, and I always paid back. Johnnie had recently come into a small sum of money, and lots of people had taken him for a ride. I mean, a lot of the people around Soho, and a lot of people who should have been very friendly, were pretty ruthless in extracting money from him. And Johnnie very reluctantly parted with this money. He made it clear that he didn't really think he was ever going to see it back. And I went to France, enjoyed myself thoroughly, came back, got the £10, so went to see Johnnie immediately, paid him the money. He was so delighted and so overwhelmed, he took me out and spent the entire £10 on me that evening.
And a taxi pulled up and the voice said, "Sherry!" And out jumped Francis Bacon. And he said, "You look absolutely awful," he said, screaming at me. He said, and I had this old overcoat on. He said, "Why do you buy some decent clothes?" And I said, "Oh, I'm broke." He said, "Well, what are you doing?" So I said, "I don't know, I'm trying to get some work." And he produced a £5, little white £5 notes, and stuck it in my pocket. He said, "Go to Wheeler's and buy yourself some oysters and cheer yourself up." So this £5 note, well, £5 in those days was a lot of money. I mean, the average wage was about £4 a week, so it'd be the equivalent of about £200 now or something, So I thought, oh well. So I went into the French pub, and I think beer was 9 pence a half, I think, in those days. And I thought, well, if I take a £5 note out, and there was people like Jeff and everybody around, and they think I was a millionaire. So I borrowed 1 6 from someone in the corner, bought myself half a bitter, went round the corner, bought some cigarettes and changed the £5, paid the bloke back. Because, I mean, I didn't dare pull a £5 note out. And anyway, I was walking past Wheeler's and I thought, oh, am I going to waste £1 on half a dozen oysters, or whatever it would have been in those days. You know, I've only got £5, and I thought, well, I suppose I ought to, as he said, go to Wheeler's. I went into the bar, which is the cheaper way, and I had half a dozen oysters and a glass of Chablis. And I sat there, and suddenly Johnny Minton walked in with 3 sailors. And he went by, and he said, what are you doing? What are you doing, dear boy, in Wheeler's? I said, I'm having some oysters. Johnny, good. He said, how are things? So I said, fine. And he sat down in the corner with his sailors. And he said, come and join us, we'll have some lobster. So I went over and sat with him, and suddenly I looked at him, and there was Francis Bacon. He'd been there all the time, and I think he was checking to see whether, in fact, I was going to go to Wheeler's, or whether I was just going to con him for £5. And he came over to Johnny, and he said, I thought you said this boy was very talented, looking at me, you see, which was most embarrassing. He said, I see him walking the streets, and I'm looking like a tramp, he said, this ghastly overcoat. And he said, they're wasting your money on these bloody sailors, he said. And with that, Francis walked out. I think he was a bit pissed, actually. And Johnny said, well, why didn't you phone me? So I said, well, you know, why should I phone you? He said, well, if you're broke, you phone me, don't you? Everybody else does. Yeah, I think he caught on to those who were the sponges, basically. But, yes, he tried to be quiet about money, but he couldn't help it. I mean, I remember going to him and Ryan, very funny, because he was always buying sailors' motorbikes. And I can remember going saying, Johnny, can you think you can get me a Triumph 250? You know? And everybody fell about laughing.
I might be stressing this too much, but it is something that I feel quite strongly, that in the earlier days, when I first met him, he had this remarkable facility, and he could sit down, he could draw. Without the drawings or anything becoming overtly homosexual. They were overtly romantic, which ultimately I fell out of sympathy with. But later on, he just couldn't help this thing. It was the pressure was too great on him, I think. And he was desperate for a relationship, and it showed in the paintings that he did. A desperation crept through, and I think that was very sad. I think he knew it.
I mean, for instance, I didn't even know anything about homosexuality. I didn't know it existed. And when I found out, it was through Keith Thorne. Because what happened was I would be about 17, and we were in the Café Royal, I remember very well. And Keith said to me, you realise that John is very much in love with you. And I thought, love? How can I be in love? I'm a man. You know, I thought, love? It's completely threw me. And I went back to Campbell, to the art school, and Monty Sunshine was a year older than me, and he was more worldly wise in a sense. He was sort of an East End Jewish boy, and I think he knew a lot more about life than I did. And he said to me, I said, how can Johnny Minton be in love with you? He said, well, he's a homosexual. And I said, what's a homosexual? And he told me. I couldn't believe it. I thought Minton wouldn't do things like that. It just never occurred to me. But then, of course, I caught on very quickly. I sort of started reading, and I spoke to people, and, you know, one gradually realised. And it was very sad, because I was so fond of Johnny, and he never had made any advances, except one night we had to share a bed because we went to the theatre, or no, we went to the cinema, and came up, the trains had busted at Charing Cross or something, and fog or something like that, and so I'd had to stay the night at his studio. Because he had people staying there, we had to share a bed, and in the night he put his arm around me, which didn't worry me in the slightest bit, because I mean, I slept with my father and my brother, and then he started shaking, and the next thing I knew, he burst out crying. And I said, what's wrong? And he got up and slept on the floor. And then I realised, I was putting two and two together, that he was obviously upset because he wanted to make love. And that's the first time and the only time that Johnny ever made any kind of physical move towards me.
I'd come from a grammar school background where there was a lot of talk of what do they call them, the Nancy boys and that sort of thing, and bum boys. And it was all slightly unreal to me because, to the best of my knowledge, I'd never met one. You know? And then I met Johnny and didn't recognise one when I saw one. That's not immediately, but he was fairly quick to come out as far as we were concerned, I think. Although, of course, he didn't make a big thing about it in public. I mean, he never made a statement about it or anything like that. But then nobody did. You know, wouldn't it be expected to? It was a criminal offence after all.
I honestly don't think he wanted to be a homosexual. I think he would like to have been a hetero. I know he just knew he couldn't be. But the point was this, he was always attracted to men who were not homosexual. And it was all doomed to disaster.
When we first met him, Johnny was just drinking as anybody else did, halves of bitter, That was, I mean, occasionally a whiskey if he could get it, but you know, it wasn't easy to get hold of. And I dare say other spirits, but you know, we weren't heavy drinkers then. It was much more sort of social drinking. Get an occasional bottle of bad wine. When I came out of the army, Johnnie was drinking a good deal more then, but I didn't see any of the viciousness of it until about 1955, and then it was bad. Well, he was certainly got extremely drunk at the party at our exhibition in 1955, and then we had an exhibition, Bobby, Peter Dunbar and I, in St George's Gallery in early '56, and we had a party there. Johnnie must have been there. I can't remember. It was chaotic, but we didn't sell anything. And Bobby, I went back to stay with Bobby in Johnnie's studio, and I was appalled. I remember to see how far gone Johnnie was at that time. He was drinking very, very heavily.
A lot of people said, I think one of Johnny's weaknesses was he didn't really like living alone. He desperately wanted company. And I think where someone like Francis Bacon would go a month and we wouldn't see him, he wouldn't drink, he'd lock himself in his room and he'd paint. Maybe wander off round the corner and get some lunch at lunchtime or cook himself something, you know. But then he would go on the drink. Once he finished, you know, go through, say, a month, really hard work, working every day, he would then sort of have a month out eating wheelers and drinking champagne and enjoying himself, going down to the south of France or wherever he was. But Johnnie wasn't like that. Johnnie used to sort of do it in short bouts, like 3 days not drinking, working very hard, and say 3 very heavy days drinking. And where someone like Francis ate very sensibly and lived things like would just live on seafood and salad and champagne, Johnnie mixed his. You know, it was whiskey, Pernod, champagne, wine, beer, food, and sometimes he didn't eat properly.
And the other thing was that he felt that his paintings, I'm sure that he felt that his paintings simply weren't working out. There were other people appearing on the horizon. There were the so-called kitchen sink school, who I think a number of them he genuinely liked as painters. I don't know how well he knew them, although they had been students of his at the Royal College, but I never met them with him socially. I mean, I subsequently got to know Ed Middleditch very well, but I certainly never saw Ed with Johnnie. And I think that he began to feel that he wasn't fitting in and he couldn't see how he could fit in and what the next move was. And then there was this awful thing which was happening as far as a lot of painting were concerned, this business of abstract expressionism, which they couldn't understand, they couldn't come to terms with. I mean, some people tried to. Rodrigo Moignan had an exhibition of Tachist paintings, which wasn't very highly regarded, certainly not by me. But I mean, it was difficult self-consciously. I think for any artist, it's always difficult self-consciously to make a change in your work. I mean, it evolves naturally, it seems to me, or not at all. I can't see how else it could happen. And Johnnie's work was not evolving. He was simply repeating himself, and not very satisfactorily. And it lost any. He was no longer enthralled by the process, I think. But he just felt that he had to go on. That's what he had to do.
Then he said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "I'm going to the pictures now." He said, "What are you going to say?" I said, "War and Peace." And he broadly laughed. He said, "Oh, the Hollywood War and Peace." I said, "That's right." You know, I was with the Henry Fonda, and I said, "Must see it." And it was the first week. It was the cinema in Piccadilly Circus, the Plaza, wherever it is. And he'd already seen it. He said, "Well, actually, bits of it are all right." He said, "You can't make War and Peace in a 2-hour movie, but you know, it'd be quite fun to go and see it." And I was meeting my wife and 2 friends to go and see the film. So we left Apollo Place, say, about 6:30 in the evening, and we walked up to King's Road, and I was going to get a number 17 or 19 bus, whatever it is, along to Piccadilly Circus. And when the bus came, I went upstairs, and there's a pub on the corner by the bus stop, and I suddenly saw Johnnie run into the pub as I crossed up. It was the last time I ever saw him alive. And I thought he's not drinking. I thought, why is he going into the pub? He's not drinking. Well, evidently, he then went on to the Chelsea Arts Club, and it started a very heavy drinking weekend. And people told me afterwards, he was seen on the Saturday, he went to Soho. Gaston Bellamont of the French pub said he saw him there on the Saturday night. And he was seen on Sunday drinking all over the place. And on the Monday morning, I got out, went to go to Chelsea to order the materials. I was walking down Beaufort Street, and I met two friends of mine who stopped me, and they said, "Have you heard the news this morning?" I said, "No," but it was on the 9 o'clock news. I said, "Johnny Minton's been found dead."
I think death always comes as a surprise, doesn't it? It was a shock, but I think, as far as I was concerned, it was a shock that I quickly realised the sort. I don't know. Hindsight, as you see, it's a terrible thing, isn't it? I felt that he was burnt out, and I couldn't see where he was going. So no, it didn't come as a particular shock to me. Not after a bit of reflection. It was just a terribly sad thing. I've never been to a sadder burial ceremony, because people who'd known each other for years just walked away at the end of it. They just couldn't talk to each other.
I mean, Johnny used to say, you know, if you haven't made it by the time you're 40, there's no point. That was one of his statements he used to make all his life. Because I remember when I got to 40 thinking, well, I haven't made it. And I got very depressed, got rather pissed. And I felt I was only 39, so I'd forgotten I was 40. I let that one slip by.